Psilocybin is being studied as a possible therapy for depression and many different things. It is also, for some people, followed by difficulties that can outlast the drug by years. Welcome to the podcast for Stories of Change and the Science of Starting Again. It's great to have you here. I'm a psychology and publishing graduate, and I spend my time reading books on psychology and beyond. And this is where I explore some of them with you. So today I wanted to look at psychedelics, and especially psilocybin. The book is How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan from 2018. Pollan is a journalist. He reports from clinical trials and he shares also his own experiences trying psychedelics. Then there's a 2023 study by Jules Evans and colleagues on the difficulties that can persist after psychedelic use. And finally, a small brain study from earlier this year, 2026, by a team that includes Robin Carhart-Harris. I'll come back to that one briefly near the end. So the plan is to put the two next to each other, the more hopeful account and the research on the difficulties that can follow. The other is simple. First, what psilocybin is, then the case Michael Pollan makes of it, then the research on the harder side, then what's still unknown, and a little question to take away at the end. So first, what is psilocybin? Psilocybin is the active compound in a family of mushrooms, what most people just call magic mushrooms. The term psychedelic was coined in 1956 by a psychiatrist called Humphrey Osmond, from the Greek for mind manifesting. The idea that the drug brings what's already in your mind to the surface. The thing Pollan keeps returning to is that the chemical is actually only half of it. What seems to matter just as much is the experience it sets off and the whole frame around that experience. Researchers use two terms for this. One is regrouped by set and setting, which refers to the mindset and expectations you arrive with, and the people, the place, and the preparation. The other is integration, so the work that comes afterwards, sometimes weeks or months of it. The duration varies, and it's all about making sense of what happened, which is why this whole approach has its own name in the field, which is psychedelic-assisted therapy. So, what's the case this book makes for it? At some trial doses, people describe what the researchers call a mystical experience, specific enough that they actually measure it with a questionnaire. They mean a familiar set of feelings, that everything is connected, that the usual sense of self falls away, that time and space stop feeling normal, and that some important truth has been revealed. Something people come away certain of, even though they can't put it into words. Pollan's central claim is that this experience is what actually makes the difference. The people who have it most strongly tend to be the ones who improve the most. Then there are the trials themselves. The results Pollan reports come from small and early trials. In two of them, at NYU and Johns Hopkins, terminally ill cancer patients were given psilocybin for the anxiety and depression that often comes with a terminal diagnosis. In both, around 80% had a clear, measurable drop in those symptoms that lasted at least 6 months. In a third, at Imperial College London, 12 people whose depression hadn't responded to other treatments were giving it. All improved at first, and about 2/3 were free of depression for a time. Pollan also explains what might be happening in the brain. So it goes roughly like this. There's a network, the default mode network, that's most active when you turn inward, dwelling on yourself, going over the past, worrying, etc. So it's closely tied to your sense of self. Under psilocybin, apparently this network quietens. And in brain scans, the people in whom it drops most tend to be the ones who report their sense of self falling away, what researchers call ego dissolution. Robin Carhart-Harris, the researcher Pollan follows here, describes it as adding entropy, loosely more disorder, and with it more flexibility. The brain normally runs in well-known patterns, and the drug briefly loosens them, letting regions that don't usually communicate connect. So on this view, addiction, obsession, depression look like a brain stuck too deep into those patterns. And psilocybin opens a short window in which they might shift. Pollan is clear this is still a hypothesis. Pollan is also honest about the known limits. The effects often fade. More than half the depression volunteers eventually relapsed. The trials are hard to run properly, too. You can't really disguise who got the drug, who got the placebo, since anyone who's taking it knows. And it isn't for everyone as well. People who are already close to psychosis can be pushed into it. So that's the case the book makes. There's also a more recent piece of research focused on the difficulties that can follow psychedelics intake. The 2023 study by Jules Evans and colleagues set out to look at something the trials mostly don't: the difficulties that linger after the drug has worn off, after the trip in itself has passed. They gathered 608 people who'd had exactly that. And to take part, you had to have already had difficulties lasting more than a day. That was the entry requirement, which means the study can tell you what some of these difficulties are like, but not necessarily how common they are. So just to be clear, there's no count here of everyone who took a psychedelic and was fine. So what did those 608 people actually describe? Within that group, the most common difficulties were emotional. About 3/4 of them, and above all, anxiety and fear. After that came changes in how people saw themselves, how they thought, and how they related to others. And then some more particular ones. Feelings that the world wasn't quite real, or that you were detached from yourself, derealization and depersonalization, along with a kind of existential struggle where people couldn't settle what was real or what anything meant. Many of these didn't pass quickly. About a third reported difficulties lasting more than a year, and about a sixth more than 3. Then there was also a different kind of difficulty within that group. Around 5% described a psychotic episode, and around 6% had thoughts of suicide or self-harm. And in 2 cases, families reported the person had taken their own life. All 608 people in the study had had a hard time. It was the requirement to be a participant in the study, just as a reminder. So some of them for years, some of them in settings as careful as in a clinical trial or a session with a trained therapist. And yet, most hadn't turned against psychedelics. Around 90% still agreed that taken in a supportive setting, the benefits were worth the risks. Over half still took them. For psilocybin in particular, the difficulties tended to be shorter-lived than other psychedelics, which leaves a question. Why would people who'd been through that still say that the benefits of psychedelics when taken in a supportive setting would be worth the risks? Both accounts leave real questions open. Two stand out: whether the benefits last and who's most likely to struggle. The picture isn't yet settled. On whether the benefits last, the recent results are mixed. A 5-year follow-up published last year tracked people from an early depression trial and reported that around 2/3 were still in full remission. Another study with US veterans found the antidepressant effects starting to fade about after 9 months. And in the Imperial College pilot Pollan describes, more than half eventually relapsed. So the durability of the effect varies and isn't settled. On who's most likely to struggle, the one factor a lot of researchers do agree on is a personal or family history of psychosis, which is why the trials screen for it. Beyond that, several other things seem to matter. Childhood trauma, the state of mind of the person beforehand, and the setting it happens in. But these are hints rather than strong predictors. The very newest piece of this, published earlier this year in 2026, is a small study by Carhart-Harris's team. They took 28 healthy, psychedelic-naive volunteers, gave them a single high dose of psilocybin, and scanned their brains before and a month after. A few things have changed at 1 month. Small, but measurable gains in cognitive flexibility, in well-being, and in what the researchers call psychological insight. But the bigger, acute brain changes, the loosened patterns, the new crosstalk between regions, didn't clearly persist. The authors describe them as largely absent. The researchers themselves call it exploratory. Even setting aside whether the changes last, there's another question worth holding here, I think. Could a brief experience of feeling differently be valuable in itself as a glimpse of another way to live that you could then choose to move toward? That's not something the studies can settle again. And given the risks we've seen, it's a question each person has to weigh for themselves. As it is true for most modern treatments and of living things unaddressed as well. One question then to leave you with: what is the hardest thing you've been through that you'd still call worth it? And what made it so?